1 year ago, the word keeper Enoch was kicked out of House Cawdor for concealing the fact that he was a psyker, banished to roam the wastes between hives. Now, Ballast the Wretched has decided to pursue his former master and take vengeance on him for his betrayal. This time on JD in the Sump Sea. Welcome back to JD in the Sump Sea. I'm Jay, and today's video is about building my Ash Waste Cawdor game for the Ash Wastes weekend. And if you like Necromunda miniature painting, terrain crafting, gang building, and campaign discussions, then make sure you bust out your Warhammer and smash that like button, and smash that subscribe button, and don't forget to hit that bell icon so you don't miss any of our videos. And now, on to the show. I've already made 2 videos about the 2024 Ash Waste weekend, one of which is an overview, the other is a gang showcase. You can watch them at my playlist here. What I haven't done yet, however, is talk about the gang that I brought to the event. To begin talking about this gang, I have to first talk about last year's gang, since it informed and inspired the construction of the gang I brought this year. Last year, I brought a Cawdor outcast gang, whose leader was named Enoch. He had been kicked out of House Cawdor by the Thane for lying about the fact that he was a psyker, straight into the Ash Wastes and banished him from Hive Primus. He was eventually supposed to perish in the harsh environment, or at least that's what they had hoped. That was my gang last year, a Cawdor outcast gang out in the Ash Wastes, just trying to scrape by and make a living and survive. Why he wasn't immediately turned over to the black ships of the Inquisition or summarily executed, well, that's a story for another video. And now this year, Enoch's champion from his previous gang, whose name is Ballast, known as the Wretch, has now gone out to the Ash Waste to search for Enoch. The anger Ballast feels for the betrayal of Enoch has been stoked by a mysterious whisper merchant known only as the Observer. This is the basis of the story for the gang that I brought to this event, and the other thing that I wanted to include with them is the idea of walkers. Since Cawdor's official mount is a small walker, I figured it would be kind of fun to have a gang based around walkers. Have a whole lot of Cawdor on walkers roaming through the wastes. So I wanted to build at least one custom vehicle that was a walker. So to get started building the gang, I did 3 ridge walkers and 1 custom walker vehicle. I had a juvie, a ganger, a specialist, 2 champions, and of course Ballast, my leader. The large walker I made was out of an AT-ST model from Star Wars that I had had for quite a while. This was the core of the gang, and I had to make sure that I got it painted before the event started. So they were the primary focus of my painting efforts. Once they were done, I would then focus to the rest of the gang. The rest of the gang was an additional specialist, another champion, some more brethren, also known as the gangers of the House Cawdor, and the juvies of House Cawdor, the bone pickers. And also I had a tracked vehicle that I'd made. Those were all secondary, and I would build those and use them during the campaign, since it was a weekend-long campaign, and I would need to have extra models to be able to purchase as I gained credits throughout the weekend. So if you're ever going to a weekend campaign event, make sure that you have extra models that you can purchase with the credits you earn, or at least from your downtime credits that you may get. Well, now that I have a plan, let's get painting. As you can see here, I painted Obed first. I brought him to the game store, Old Guard Games, and Jacob Ty and I had a painting session one Thursday between campaigns. I wanted to paint up a test model first to get an idea of the look of the gang. I quite liked the color scheme once I had finished him, so I decided to continue with this color scheme throughout the rest of the gang. I picked up Occam, one of the brethren, and began with the GW contrast paint Snakebite Leather. I chose all of the essential models and began my assembly line because, again, time was tight, and so I started painting. Once that color was done, I grabbed my War Colors Nostalgia 94 Goblin Green paint, squeezed a drop out of it into my dollar store paint palette, and got to work painting the tabards and the cowls, and I hit all the essential models. I then went back to contrast paint for their legs and some other cloth parts of the models. I used Games Workshop's Skeleton Horde contrast paint for these areas of the models. I then switched back again to War Colors Nostalgia 94 paint line and used their Serpent Bite leather for boots, the nooses, and other leathery, strappy bits. I then went to Games Workshop's Lead Belcher, painted it right onto the Zenithal undercoat. I knew this would be pretty bright, but I was going to wash everything in a later step to darken the colors. On the Ridgewalkers, I had to go back and get all the details with Goblin Green and Serpent Bite Leather again. I then started painting flesh with Bronzed Flesh, again from Nostalgia Line. I also like craft paints, so I used this Craft Smart tan color paint for one of my fighter's hair. I then had to do touch-ups on all the Way Brethren and the Ridgewalkers. I also painted the details now, like blue wires and yellow spotlights. And now basically all the details and solid colors were done. It was time to dirty everything up with some Agrax Earthshade all over the models. I decided to switch things up at this point, and I started working on their bases. I wanted them to look like partially sand-covered Zone Mortalis bases, since they were emerging from the hive and heading out into the Ash Wastes. I took some hobby sand and added Mod Podge to it, mixed it up, and started adding it to parts of their bases. After a day of drying, I came back to the gang and got them all finished, except for the tracked vehicle, which I didn't finish until I got to Lacrosse and the Ash Waste weekend. And then I started in earnest on the Walker. I began after the Zenithal highlight by painting the legs with a watered down black. I then opened up a pot of Wild Rider Red by Games Workshop and began doing heavy dry brushing on certain areas of the model. I like to use an orange dry brush to begin with when I want to paint metal bits that look rusted. I then did some dry brushing with Lead Belcher in various spots, including most of the legs. I took out the Nostalgia Goblin Green again and painted specific areas in that color. I like to paint these ramshackle Ash Waste vehicles that I make look like they were being built from found parts throughout the wastes, so I like to use a patchwork of colors to illustrate that idea. I opened Nostalgia's Enchanted Blue and mixed it with the green to give kind of a turquoise color, and painted other parts of the Walker with this new color I just mixed up. I then used straight Enchanted Blue and painted the headlight cowl. GW's Retributor Armor Gold color was next, and I used this on the exhaust pipe sticking up from the center of the Walker. I also painted the small bells and the rear exhaust pipe. I painted the various skulls around the model and on the base with white. I put some bronze flesh onto the corpse hanging off the front. I then used the contrast paint Athermentic Blue on some of the Zenithal base coated areas that I had not yet painted. Skeleton Horde was used on some of the skull and parchment areas to give more depth and definition. I went back to Lead Belcher to get some areas I hadn't yet touched, like the floor on the interior of the Walker. I figured at this point I was basically done, so I opened a pot of Agrax Earthshade and generously slopped it all over almost the entire model. I went online to look for some models for hanging cages, and I couldn't find very many, so I talked to Josh from Badger Games about 3D printing some. He told me to look online for STLs, and I found several different designs online for free. Josh was able to then print out about 10 cages, and I picked 2 for this build. I had some old zombies I made for my old Lost and Damned army from 3rd edition 40k, and I figured they'd make great prisoners for the cages. I cut off the weapons they had and cut them off their bases and glued them to the cage bases. I then painted the cages black, both on the inside and outside. I then thought the bright colors the zombies were painted were just too much, so I took some flesh-colored paint and dry brushed over the bright pink and green of their skin. I then glued them into the cages and finished the cages with some red and silver paint. So this is the display base from last year's Ash Waste Weekend Gang. This display base is the size it is because of the tray that it fits in. This tray makes it so easy to carry the display base and the gang around the venue during the event that every year I simply remake a display base to this tray's dimensions. So let's do that now. These Artist Lofts brand canvases are very sturdy and meant to take paint, so they actually don't warp much. And if they do warp, it's not noticeable in the tray, so it doesn't really matter. I like using these since they take paint nicely and they're easy to glue things to. They're just nice to work with, are cheap and easily obtainable from Michael's here in the States. So instead of measuring, I just trace around the edges of last year's display base to get the dimensions I need. I then use a metal ruler and cut using an X-Acto blade down the lines I just drew. I probably should have had a sharper knife to do this, but after a number of cuts it worked. I then fit it into the tray and it was a little large, so I took it out again and cut off another 2/16 of an inch or so maybe, and then it fit perfectly. Now I needed something to build with. I had a concept since this gang was leaving Hive Primus to go out to the Ash Wastes to hunt down Enoch, their former leader, that this display base would be showing the gang leaving Hive Primus through a large door or gateway. So I needed to build a tall wall with a door large enough for my walker to get through. I had an old Necromunda terrain piece that I had built back in probably 2018 or so, shortly after I got into this new version of Necromunda. I built it out of a lot of old 40k building kits. It was such a large piece of terrain on such a large base that it never left my house. It was just too difficult to transport. I figured this would be the perfect piece to tear down and use as parts for my new display base. It was made with mostly hot glue, so it wasn't actually that difficult to pull apart with just my hands. As you can see, some parts of it had come off the base already. While I really liked this piece when I made it, it had become kind of a mental burden to me, and it felt good taking this apart, knowing that I was about to build something new and exciting out of it. It can be cathartic sometimes to tear down and reuse old pieces of terrain, so don't be afraid to do this to your terrain or even your old models. It will save you money, and the end result can be so satisfying and hopefully more useful to you and your gaming group. What was funny was I forgot that I had built this from a pumpkin bread kit from Trader Joe's back in 2018. It was a fun surprise liberating the box from inside this ruined factory building that I built. So now I'm just laying out the various pieces I salvaged from this teardown to get an idea of what I have to work with. Since I built the old building using that box as a base, and it was not the height of these GW plastic pieces, I had to cut some of them down to the right height. I wanted to make sure I used all or most of these pieces on the new display base, so that's why in the finished product that there are some cut down sections of this terrain. Okay, now that I had my components to work with, I needed to draw out where the wall and the gate were going to be on my base. I also had to put my walker there to gauge how big the opening needed to be. I wanted some of the floor pieces to be on the ground like they were a metal road of walkway coming out from the gate. When the piece was done, they would be partially covered with sand. The side of these double door openings have some great details, and I thought they would be great as the sides of the massive opening in the hive wall, so I began cutting them apart. I figured I would need 3 stacked on top of each other on each side of the opening. I glued a right angle together from 2 of the wall sections to act as the inside of the opening and for a support to glue the tall sections to. I commenced with gluing them together and to the base. I then glued down the base plates right in front of the entryway. You'll see me use hot glue for most of this project, and that's because it sticks very fast and it works pretty well for the most part, holding things together. It's a way to quickly build large terrain structures. I do recommend trying to enforce the hot glue in a later step on your terrain piece if you use hot glue, because over time the hot glue will usually give way. You'll also see me using a hobby knife along the edges of these plastic pieces quite a bit. That's because even before I used these to build the terrain piece that I tore down earlier, these were glued together and used as other pieces of terrain many years ago. There are many layers of super glue, hot glue, and paint on these pieces, and I love the fact that they've gotten so much use over the years. Reusing and recycling terrain is not only fun, but cheap, environmentally friendly, and also cathartic. I recommend it. As I turned the display base around, I realized I hadn't glued the walls to it in the right places, so I had to pull off the left wall section and re-glue it. Another advantage of hot glue is that it is easy to pull apart and redo if necessary. I now have the height I need, and now I'm just reusing that interesting plastic piece I tore off the old building as the top of the gateway. Now it's time to build the walls up to that height. Back to the front of the build, I wanted to extend the roadway out from the hive, but I don't have enough of those plastic floor sections, so I just reused the balsa wood from the old factory I tore down. Now it's time to add some details like some railings along the top of the wall and some gargoyles and some buttresses. I also added arches onto the outside for more detail. At this point I feel it's time to add the spackle to the base. I'm not doing anything to the spackle, I'm just going to grab a plastic knife and apply it like butter to bread onto the base. I want it to partially cover the road sections and to end at the entrance. A lightweight spackle is the way to go here, otherwise your terrain piece is going to weigh a ton when you're done with it. Once it's applied, I immediately start putting down other random bits into the spackle so that once it's dry, they'll be partially embedded in it. I also then cover them a little bit in some spackle. I figure out a big pipe sticking out from the side of the hive and going into the ground will look pretty cool, so I reuse the smokestack from the factory building and add a T plumbing pipe section to the top. I didn't have an elbow section, and this gives me the added bonus of adding some goo to the inside of the pipe at the end of the build. I'm sure iPaintSmallThings will approve. The pipe looks okay as is, but I decided to add a little detailing to the sides and top of it with some cereal box cardboard strips and little pieces of balsa wood. These yellow pipe sections were from a dollar store toy, and I liked how they looked, so started gluing them together. I thought at first maybe I'd use them as additional vertical piping detail on the exterior of the wall, but I changed my mind about them and used them in a different way later. Now I needed to make a back to the wall. I didn't want there to be just a thin wall that looked kind of one-dimensional and fake. I wanted a solid-looking wall that looked like one of those cross-sections in a textbook. So I had some foam core pieces sitting around, and I decided that would be a perfect back. In fact, this piece right here was the perfect size, no trimming was necessary. It was slightly shorter than the base, which would make it perfect for adding bevels to the edges of the wall. I then measured up and cut an end vertical wall section out of some more foam core and then added the top walkway. This walkway was where I decided to put that yellow pipe from earlier. I then continued to add detail to the top walkway in the form of junk that had accumulated there over the years, plastic GW kit pieces, large barrels from some toy, pieces of balsa wood, and other random things from my bits box. Now that everything was finally assembled, it was time to seal it all together and add additional texture to the whole piece. Using a mixture of water, Mod Podge, and sand, I then covered the entire display board and allowed it to dry overnight. This application ties everything together, and it also makes it much more stable. The hot glue that I used to glue everything together is now sealed tight in a layer of Mod Podge, making it much stronger and less likely to break apart. I then took the finished display base to the hardware store, and I had Dale help me spray the base coat on. We did a couple of different colors and then settled on doing a silvery color that we could then paint on top of. Thank you for watching, and I hope that this inspired you to build your own gang for Necromunda. I will be putting out more short videos on YouTube and on Instagram in the coming week that show off the models even more. So, look forward to that, and as always, thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.